The Scottish Government's wild salmon strategy sets out a vision of what the Scottish Government and indeed the wider community would like to see happen in respect of salmon. And it's just part of a wider understanding on the environmental front that, we can't go on like this. Net zero, whether you set some earlier or later target, is a requirement that we transform our economies from being essentially carbon-based, overwhelmingly carbon-based, to being ones where we're emitting very little carbon. Notwithstanding the fact that the world's economy is 80% dependent on carbon, and that almost everything that you and I consume is soaked in carbon. It's also widely recognised that we can't allow biodiversity to carry on collapsing. The salmon are part of that story, but just a part. The rivers are just a part of that story, but an incredibly important component. And so the good news is that there's a general understanding that more of the same won't work, that we have to move on and we have to decide how we're going to bequeath to the next generation an environment at least as good as the one we've had, and actually probably a lot better. That's what's up there for the challenge of everyone now. And the good news, as I say, is that it's widely understood that that challenge is out there. Of course, there's affordability problems, there's energy crisis problems, there are all the difficulties caused by the brutal and evil invasion of Ukraine and what they're doing to world markets, food markets and so on. But the fundamental direction of travel, the vision, is at least pretty widely shared. So how do you do this? Now, the traditional way of looking at these sorts of problems is to take a fish like salmon or a particular species like capercaillie and say, we've got to save this species. And what that does is it channels efforts, rightly so, but it neglects the fundamentals that lie behind the protection of particular species, which is the protection of the ecosystems in which they are situated. And when it comes to salmon, when it comes to fish generally, we have a natural classification of our land. It's called catchments. And what happens in any river and river catchment is part and parcel of the actions of a whole host of players and a whole host of initiatives, only some of which are directly involved in the river itself. So if we want to see this vision of thriving wild salmon populations for the next generation and the generation after, because they're not only wonderful, but because they're renewable natural capital and nature can go on giving them to us for free for tens of thousands of years if we don't muck it up and take them below the threshold by which they can reproduce. So if we want to see this, if we want to make this happen, we have to go catchment by catchment, and we have to think about how to map the catchment, how to assess the natural capital in the catchment, how to work out what would be the capital maintenance of the catchment necessary to stop it going further downhill. And we have to look at the enhancement opportunities, and there are many in which we can devote resources, and, as they say, make things better. And once you look at a catchment, you realise that it's a crucial building block for any net zero policy. It's a crucial building block for the development of greater forest cover. It's a crucial building block, of course, for agriculture. All agriculture happens ultimately in catchments, or pretty much all. It's a crucial building block for biodiversity. It's a crucial building block for thinking about mental and physical health benefits, for water, and also, of course, for the salmon and the rivers themselves. So how do we do this? Well, we start off with working out what we've got. If you don't know what you've got, you don't know what you're losing. Okay? So a baseline needs to be established. We have to assess what's in each catchment. Now, many environments say, but this is creeping baselines. We don't want the current baseline, and we've already done a lot of damage. Why don't you choose a baseline for 1950 or 1970 or whenever, for example, the salmon population was high? Yeah, that's interesting. But the fact is, we are where we are. And we want to make sure that we understand where we are so that we can work out what kinds of interventions will make things better, and dare I say it, which might make things worse. Okay? So we need to have a resolution of the data to work out what our tree cover is, what the species are, where there are hedgerows, what they look like, what the peat looks like, what the grazing looks like, what the river flows look like, where the sewage works are, all those component parts, where the flood defence issues are, and so on and so forth. Because at least with a baseline, we can start with the facts, and we have a baseline against which to simulate the kind of opportunities there might be to make things better, and in particular, of course, to improve the lot of the salmon. Some of these might be pretty straightforward. It might be that we need some broadleaf woodland to provide shade and shelter and water holding for floods and water runoff. It might be that we need to think about the density of sheep on upland peatlands and the runoffs that come from this and the acidification that flow. It might be we need to consider riverbank access so that people can get the mental and physical benefits. It might mean that we need to think about how to control fast runoffs so that we don't have sewage works discharging into rivers, and so on and so forth. And then we can describe onto this baseline for a catchment the sorts of opportunities that might be in front of us, given the challenges that the bigger environmental picture puts in place. And I just want to pick two of those. So let's look at net zero and let's look at carbon. There's a lot of catchment in carbon because there's a lot of catchment in soils. Of course, it varies a lot according to geology and structures and so on, but the rough metric is 4 times the carbon in the soil as in the atmosphere. Might be 3, might be less, might even be a bit more. Okay? And in peat areas, huge amounts of carbon, of course, in the soil underneath our feet. So we look at a catchment, we say, first of all, let's not leak any more carbon. Let's not have any more carbon emissions. And then let's think about how to sequestrate more carbon into that land. And that has payoffs. Of course, it probably helps with runoff and limits pollution to the river. Carbon-rich soils probably have cover, probably have protection, probably aren't overgrazed, etc. But it also enhances biodiversity. Roughly, the carbon in the soil is a pretty good proxy for the amount of biodiversity, and most biodiversity is beneath your feet, not above. It's a common mistake people make. They think of trophy species as biodiversity, wolves or whatever, but actually it's the small stuff, it's the little critters and the microscopic critters that really make the difference to our ecosystems and all the support frameworks that are around that. So we can think about carbon in the soils, we can think about putting carbon back, and we can think about doing it in a way which enhances biodiversity, enhances water quality. And then we can turn ourselves to the broader story beyond carbon and focus directly on biodiversity, knowing, of course, that some of that's achieved by doing the right things for net zero emissions. You want the point where the Venn diagram intersects between carbon and biodiversity. That's where the win-wins lie. That's where the maximum payoffs are. So when it comes to biodiversity, we know a lot and a little about it. So there are great studies and great organisations and groups dedicated to protecting particular species, of which salmon's an example, but there are plenty of others. What we need to do is bring that together with the other natural capitals to try to find a route through. And remember, we don't have a definition of biodiversity because we don't actually agree what it is in the way we agree about carbon. Is it species? How many species? Is it the population of particular species, the density of population? Is it just genes, right? Is it particular kinds of genetic packages, right? What exactly is this measure? And the answer to this question is there is no right answer. So what you do is you look at it as if you're taking pictures of an object from different directions. You consider each of them and see which measures overlap best to give you that measure of biodiversity. So we can do that on a catchment basis, and of course the biodiversity in the rivers is a crucial component of this. Now then it comes to, so given this baseline, given you've worked out how to make sure that the baseline doesn't get worse, given you've got a whole series of potential enhancements you could do in the catchment, as I say, where's the money? Where's the money coming from? Who's going to actually pay for this? Because we can have great ideas about what we might like to do. We can watch it from satellites on a regular basis to see what's going on. But we want stuff actually done, practically delivered in the river, on the ground, in the catchment, in the ecosystem. And here there's good and bad news. We've never spent enough on the natural environment compared with what we're prepared to put into the built environment and other dimensions of the economy. And I say not enough because the economic opportunities are really very big. Many of those projects we can identify have big payoffs and can make a great deal of difference to our economic and therefore our social and wider well-being. So it's not as if this is a kind of luxury activity. This is a core integrated bit of the economy. So let's look at the piles of money. Okay, there's a bit of money for salmon strategies. Not much, but there's some. And some money has been spent on buying out netters and so on. There's a lot of charitable money by people who really care about our rivers and our fish, and particularly salmon, as an example. They're prepared to put their money where their wider public interests lie. But most of this is, as they say, chicken feed against the scale of the problem. So are there other sources of money that can make a difference? Well, the first thing to say is that in most catchments, not all, and it varies a lot by region and locality and particular catchment, but in most catchments, we spend a lot of money very badly. So in many circumstances, no fault to the farmers, but we actually pay them to pollute. We subsidise their pollution. And to be frank, the economic value of the output of farming is incredibly low. Overall, agriculture is about 0.5% of GDP. It's 10% plus of carbon emissions, and it is a major contributor to pollution of rivers, etc. Not all farming, and as I say, not farmers' faults, it's the incentive structure that we put in place. So if we were to start spending money on agriculture in a way which goes with the grain of nature, rather than having nature versus food as the legacy of a long history of agricultural practice, we can start limiting the damage before we start thinking about extra monetary flows. And the public money for public goods, which is the mantra of reform in England at least, is one which is catching up in Europe, in the CAP, and more widely. Different nations in the UK have different timescales and patterns, but I think everybody accepts that it's not appropriate to pay money for private goods, and it's certainly not a good idea to pay people to own land, which is what the Common Agricultural Policy has been doing. So we can make it a lot better in the agricultural sector, and within that frame, things like sheep density and so on are part and parcel of the package. Now then there's the money we spend on cleaning up the water going through water treatment works, and the money we spend in cleaning up drinking water and sewage and their component parts, the storm overflows, etc. We spend that money because we don't deal with the pollution at source. We deal with the pollution in the end of pipe and in the concrete further down the track. Again, it can be spent much more wisely. But then there's new money, of which carbon offsetting is a big ticket part. Now, there are lots of reasons why quite a bit of carbon offsetting may turn out to be greenwash. There must be concerns about simply having a private voluntary market in which any landowner can plant some trees and claim an offset. What happens to the trees as they grow? What happens about the deer? What happens about the fencing? What about the squirrels? What happens about tree disease? What happens about fires? Who guarantees these things are going to be delivered in 20, 25 years' time? What sort of trees are going to be planted? Is it eucalyptus, which grow really quickly and sequestrate a lot of carbon? Or is it serious broadleaf woodlands and the Atlantic rainforest and so on being extended back, and Scots pine and so on? These are really big ticket decisions, and they will make a great deal of difference to the quality of our water and what happens in our catchments. But if they are correctly designed, they are a flow of money into these areas, and they're significant. And similarly, net biodiversity gain brings money into catchments and has big opportunities within river systems. A lot of that's going to have to be public money, but that's because biodiversity is not a private good. But part of it's also preventing the destruction of biodiversity, and ill-sited developments and so on come into that frame. So there are revenue flows coming, and then there are revenue flows which are the more indirect and intangible ones. Who pays for protecting and enhancing the natural environment to the better mental and physical health of people? Cleaning up the Clyde has been very important because it's next to people, and natural capital next to people is very important. There are obviously big local, social, people benefits to what's being done. And by the way, it brings some salmon back as well. That's the point here. It's a multiple approach to putting these things together. So I'm in favour of looking at each major catchment, mapping it, creating baselines, measuring capital enhancement, measuring enhancements, looking at the economic benefits. I'm in favour of pooling the various monies that are spent in order to work out how to efficiently use the limited resources that are available. I'm in favour of thinking about carbon in catchments in a holistic, ecosystem-based way. I'm not in favour of Wild West of carbon offsets. I'm in favour of a proper, dare I say an old-fashioned word, planned way of enhancing what's there. And what I think the outcome of this is not only that it's so much better than the piecemeal way in which we go think about things at the moment, but it really is an opportunity to make things better, a lot better, without a lot more cost, and to meet our generation's duty, which is to ensure that the next generation gets a natural environment hopefully better than we have left it, and in the process that I won't be one of the last generation that goes salmon fishing. Thank you very much indeed.